I intended to stand by my husband's side, even if I were treated like a servant by my mother-in-law, even if my husband didn't protect me from such a mother-in-law. However, my husband changed after my brother-in-law, who was doted on by my mother-in-law, had an accident.
You're done, half paralyzed.
My husband ridiculed our unfortunate brother-in-law. Not only that, but my husband joined forces with my mother-in-law to mock me and betray me. I won't let it end like this, no matter what. Holding my brother-in-law's hand, I swore revenge against my husband and mother-in-law. My name is Mia, and I live with my husband Kent while working together. Honestly, I'm overwhelmed with work and house chores every day, and I don't have any time for myself. The reason is that I'm frequently summoned by my in-law, who lives just a few tens of minutes away from my home, and despite both of us working, my husband doesn't do any housework at all. I'm not seen as a daughter-in-law to my mother-in-law, but rather as a mermaid. Mia, today is your brother-in-law's hospital visit. My mother-in-law calls me early in the morning on my day off. My role is to take care of my brother-in-law's daily needs on my day offs. Before, I was practically forced to drive the car like a taxi driver, but now I'm taking care of my half-paralyzed brother-in-law. I'm always sorry, Mia. I shook my head in response to my apologetic brother-in-law. I'm doing it because I want to, so please don't worry, I replied with a smile. But my brother-in-law had a somewhat dark expression. Before the accident, my brother-in-law was my mother-in-law's favorite. He graduated from a prestigious university and got a job at a large company. He was kind and gentle to everyone, without any discrimination, and had a calm personality. My mother-in-law was so obsessed with him, it was as if he was her only son. As a result, my husband, who is the second son, was completely ignored. Furthermore, there were times when I was angry at my mother-in-law for her hurtful attitude towards my husband. That's why I've always had the desire to support my husband. However, the attitudes of my mother-in-law and husband changed drastically when my brother-in-law, who had an accident, became confined to a wheelchair. Honestly, I wish you would leave the house already. Becoming a disabled person who can't even earn money is a disgrace to the family. Despite all the help we've received from my brother-in-law until now, my mother-in-law treated him like an unwanted intruder, which was incredibly cruel. In addition to that, my husband started mocking my brother-in-law in agreement with my mother-in-law.
So he's paralyzed and can't even move one hand, huh? Even if you graduate from a good university, it's all over when you can't walk anymore, right?
When I think about my brother-in-law, who can no longer move his legs due to the accident, I couldn't understand how those two could say such things. Unlike my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law was kind to my husband as well. However, despite that, my husband made remarks that further cornered my brother-in-law.
Once the hospital visits are over, I hope he'll leave the family home. We can take care of my mother on our own, and he's just a nuisance, a useless disabled person after all.
I couldn't tolerate those words and found myself arguing with my husband. I explained to my husband that my brother-in-law has done so much for us in the past, and his injuries were simply the result of an unfortunate accident, so we shouldn't use such words towards my brother-in-law, who treated my husband equally, unlike my mother-in-law. I also explained how I've been treated by my mother-in-law all this time. I was subjected to verbal abuse and forced to work as a chauffeur on my day offs. Still, the reason I went along with my mother-in-law's demands was because I hoped my mother-in-law would change her attitude towards my husband and that she would acknowledge me even just a little. However, no matter how much I pleaded, my husband didn't understand. Due to my brother-in-law's accident, the way my husband was treated by my mother-in-law, which was dismissive until now, suddenly changed, and she started prioritizing my husband. As a son, it's natural that he would feel happy about it to some extent. But for me, even though I understood those feelings, I could never emphasize with them. The sudden and extreme change in her attitude was so appalling. My mother-in-law was never a personality worthy of commendation, but I never expected my husband to change so drastically. Come to think of it, my irresponsible husband often left the household chores to me. Nevertheless, I thought I saw my husband making steady efforts in his own way more than anyone else did. That's why my husband's sudden change in attitude was incredibly shocking and saddening. One day, while harboring a vague sense of frustration towards my husband and mother-in-law, my husband proposed a family trip.
I'm thinking of going on a Hawaii trip because I thought it would be nice for us to have fun for a change.
Indeed, as a working couple, we might have the means to go on a trip. But what about my brother-in-law, who is in a situation where going on a Hawaii trip is not possible? Will he be left alone at home? When I conveyed my concerns, I found out that a helper would be called in during the trip. However, I couldn't help but feel sorry for my brother-in-law, and I started feeling anxious about whether I would be able to enjoy the trip. But my husband said that it's necessary to have something to look forward to in this situation. A few days later, when I was still struggling to accept my husband's words, my brother-in-law called me. "I heard about the trip. Don't worry about me and go enjoy yourself. I'll be fine. You've always helped me with errands and hospital visits, so I want you to relax and have a good time once in a while." In response to such kind words, I jokingly replied that going on a trip with those two would probably be more exhausting than usual, and my brother-in-law laughed. Encouraged by my brother-in-law's kind words, I told my husband that we would go on a trip. And so, the preparations for the Hawaii trip began. However, it was up to me to handle the tour itinerary and communicate with the travel agency, while I was told by my mother-in-law about her preferred hotels and itinerary. However, her preferences kept changing, and I had to constantly adjust the plans. Finally, 2 weeks before departure, the plans for Hawaii were finalized. Once we arrived in Hawaii, I decided to go separate ways from my husband and mother-in-law. I was already tired of being used even before the trip, so I planned for this. I also needed some time for myself. So I endured the days leading up to the departure, thinking about the alone time I would spend in Hawaii. What I was working hard for was to help my mother-in-law with the preparations for the trip. I went to buy the items my mother-in-law needed after work, and on my day offs, I took her to the store so she could personally choose what she wanted. My mother-in-law's shopping trips took at least 4 hours. The 2 weeks leading up to the departure were incredibly busy while assisting my brother-in-law's hospital visits. And on the day of the trip, my husband and mother-in-law laughed and said to me,
"You stay behind and take care of your brother."
I was speechless at those words. I was completely dumbfounded. "I usually take care of my son, so this time I'll leave it to you. Hiring a helper costs money, but you do it for free." My husband and mother-in-law said that and burst into laughter. Seeing their attitude, I no longer felt any anger. My husband and mother-in-law headed to the airport without me, and I couldn't move from that spot even when their car disappeared from view. After unpacking my belongings at home, I headed to my in-laws' house. Using the spare key to enter the house, I told my brother-in-law about what had just happened while he was lying down in the living room. "I'm sorry for suggesting the trip, but I never expected it would turn out like this." I conveyed to my apologetic brother-in-law that this outcome was for the best. I didn't have high expectations from my mother-in-law from the start, but this incident also revealed my husband's true nature. I didn't know how to express these feelings, but it didn't matter. I reached a point where I didn't care anymore. As I looked down, I saw my brother-in-law's lower body and his immobile left hand. And in the next moment, my brother-in-law's body that was lying down suddenly stood up. His leg and arm were supposed to be immobile. "Huh? What's going on? How are you able to stand up?" I exclaimed in surprise, unable to hold back my voice. When I asked my brother-in-law, he explained that although he had been in an accident, he wasn't permanently paralyzed. It turns out that he had been wanting to remove my mother-in-law's excessive interference for a while. He had stayed at the family home because he had been convinced to continue living with her instead of living alone. "I can barely make ends meet. I can't afford to live alone." It seems that when my mother-in-law clung to my brother-in-law, he thought that if he refused, it would cause trouble to my husband and me. My mother spends money like water. I thought my life would be ruined if things continued like this. My thoughts were naive. At the time of the accident, my brother-in-law said he was thinking about how to escape from his mother without causing trouble to us. The turning point was when he lied and said he was paralyzed and unable to walk. That's when my mother-in-law's attitude changed. And just as he was wondering what to do with us, my mother-in-law began doting on my husband. Hearing that story, I felt genuinely sorry for my brother-in-law. "It's really frustrating, isn't it?" I answered with a wry smile, and my brother-in-law smiled back at me. "Well, shall we fight back then? What do you think? You can join in, Mia." I had no intention of letting it end like this. This incident truly disgusted me with my husband and mother-in-law. That's why, of course, I agreed to my brother-in-law's invitation. And 1 week later, my mother-in-law and husband returned from Hawaii. As soon as they arrived home, my husband called me.
"Hey, where are my belongings? The apartment was empty when I got back."
I told him that I had sent his belongings to my in-laws' house. "I made it so that you can live with your mother, just like you've always wanted, right?" I cheerfully conveyed the message to him, but my husband started complaining about how I had moved his stuff without his permission. Ignoring his reaction, I told him I wanted a divorce.
"This is too selfish. You want a divorce? What's gotten into you all of a sudden? What do you want?"
Now who is the selfish one? I finally started to argue back against my unreasonable husband. I confronted him, saying that he had betrayed my trust and how much I had endured for him. Additionally, during the preparations for the move, it came to light that my husband was committing even more wrongdoing. It turns out that he was secretly giving money to my mother-in-law while hiding it from me. Looking back, my mother-in-law's extravagant shopping spree continued even after my brother-in-law quit his job. I had always assumed that my brother-in-law was the one buying those things, but it turns out that he had significantly reduced his living expenses after quitting his job. That means my mother-in-law must have been getting more money from someone other than my brother-in-law. And the only possible person must be my husband. "You need to repay the money you've been using without permission. I know that $22,000 have gone missing in the past few months," I declared. In response, my husband offered feeble excuses like "but" or "because." I guess everything I said was true, so that he couldn't come up with any valid excuses. I told him that my brother-in-law had already moved out and I was living in a new place. I also made it clear that neither my brother-in-law nor I had any intention of dealing with him and his mother anymore. "So it would be better for you to live with your parents' home. After all, your family consists only of your mother-in-law, right?" I conveyed this message and was about to hang up the phone when I heard my husband's angry voice. "You really are an insolent woman. I should have divorced you much earlier, just like my mother said," my husband shouted. Even in a situation like this, he talks about his mother? Although that was my honest feeling, his words were just about right for me now. I was grateful for my husband's straightforward declaration of divorce. Shortly after that, a pre-filled divorce form from my husband arrived at the law firm I hired. I submitted the divorce papers to the city office and quickly settled the financial matters. I was finally free. But this was only the beginning. "I've submitted the divorce papers," I reported over the phone. My husband responded in a curt voice. "Now that I don't have a nagging wife and a disabled brother around, things will be much better for me. This is the best outcome, huh?" my husband said, laughing. In response, I also laughed and replied, "You know, your brother-in-law has semi-retired and is now enjoying a relaxing life abroad. Isn't that something? Didn't you know he wasn't actually paralyzed? Oh, and your mother-in-law has some debts. So, good luck to both of you in repaying those debts." I thought I heard my husband's voice saying, "Huh?" but I pretended not to hear it, hung up the phone, and blocked his number. We're already strangers, so I don't need to care about him anymore. It was a month later when I received a letter from my ex-husband Kent through a lawyer. The contents of the letter were complaints and apologies about how he couldn't possibly live with my mother-in-law alone and an unthinkable proposal to remarry me. "I often wish you were still with me. My salary alone can't support my mother anymore. It's impossible." His letter was filled with such silly woes. Moreover, there were traces of tears in the letter that seemed to be from my ex-husband, which made me feel sick, so I threw it away immediately. It seems that my ex-husband lost all his assets to repay my mother-in-law's debts. However, it wasn't enough to repay the debts, and it seems that they ended up having to let go of the family home. As for what my mother-in-law is doing, she's desperately searching for my brother-in-law who went overseas. My brother-in-law told me that my mother-in-law has been contacting his acquaintances in the former company recently. "If things continue like this, my second son would suffer. I want to see my older son." She's apparently saying things like that while searching for my brother-in-law's whereabouts. However, none of my brother-in-law's acquaintances have any intention of telling her, and even if she finds out where my brother-in-law is, she wouldn't be able to go there. It seems that living with Kent has been so difficult for my mother-in-law. Since the divorce, I have been living a peaceful life in a new apartment for single persons. The current lifestyle is very calm, and I wonder what those hectic days were all about. It's been a year since the divorce, and for the past 6 months, I haven't received any contact from my ex-husband. And today, I received an email from my brother-in-law abroad after a long time. The content of the email was a report that my mother-in-law had finally gone bankrupt. It seems that my mother-in-law's name was even listed in the official gazette. So I did some research and found out that Kent and my mother-in-law are currently living together in a small one-room apartment. Of course, they are not on good terms just because my mother-in-law refuses to let go of Kent. Kent is managing to make a living while in debt, all for the sake of my mother-in-law's uncontrollable spending habits. I'm truly disgusted by the two of them, so recalling the past doesn't make me angry at all. The revenge that my brother-in-law and I carried out, which we call a counterattack, seems to have had more than enough effect.